All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our third week for PPA 555, Public Budgeting and Finance. It's kind of hard to believe, but after tonight's session, we will be halfway through our term together, which is, again, just kind of the nature of summer session. And it does go by very, very quickly, and we do accelerate the information a great deal. So we are progressing along very quickly to the end of our term together. Let me just give you a real quick reminder before we jump into our information for the evening. That is on June 12th, you have two assignments that are coming due. You have your pre-instructional assignment, and then you also have Canvas essay number 2 with responses to classmates. Now, for the pre-instructional assignment, a couple of people have already turned it in, but just to remember on that pre-instructional assignment for questions numbers 5 and 6, where you're giving me the revenues and the expenditures for the city, please do give me a table for 5 as well as for 6. It can be a very simple table, just a 3-column table. In the first column, you tell me the source of revenue. In the second column, the amount that's being generated from that source of revenue. And then the third column, the percentage of total revenue that's being generated from that source. And then for the expenditure question, same type of thing, a 3-column expenditure table, object of expenditure in column 1, in column 2, the amount that's being spent on that object of expenditure, and then in column 3, the percentage of total expenditures that are being made up by that one object of expenditure. So again, just those really simple 3-column tables for both of those questions would work out very, very well. So, and then for your Canvas essay number 2, you are going to be sharing with your colleagues the budget format that you think your budget represents from your city. And then if you had to recommend a different budget format, what would that budget format be and why? So if you see that your city is using a line item budget format, then you would want to pick either performance program or zero-based budgeting as a recommended format to replace that line item type of an approach. So pre-instructional assignment as well as Canvas essay number 2. Again, with the pre-instructional assignment, I do realize that design so that you don't use any information from the class in answering those 8 questions. But I also realize we've already covered budget formats last week, and we're going to continue with that discussion at the outset of class tonight. So actually, you do have the information to answer the budget format question. So you can go ahead and give it a shot at answering what type of budget format your city is using. And we left off last week, we had talked about the 4 different budget formats. We're going to pick up on that this evening. At the beginning of class, I will go through some examples of performance-based and program-based and zero-based budgets, just so you can kind of get a feel of what they look like if you haven't dealt with them before. Then we'll switch gears and move into a discussion of the applications of analysis in public budgeting. And we'll talk about how we analyze budgets for different purposes. We'll talk about the strategies and techniques we use to analyze budgets for revenue forecasting. We will also talk about why we analyze budgets for cost estimation. We'll talk about analyzing budgets for a variety of different break-even analysis and a variety of other reasons why we analyze our budgets. And I will pay particular attention to analyzing budgets for the purpose of measuring fiscal solvency. And so we will also then share out the 10 indicators of fiscal solvency from Brown. And then we'll also look at Wang, Tu, and Dennis and their fiscal solvency indicators. Talk about how those ratios are calculated. Talk about where you find that information in order to calculate those ratios, so that once you get to your post-instructional assignment and you're answering that fiscal solvency question again, this will be the type of information you can use to answer that fiscal solvency question. So on the pre-instructional, if you said, I do not have the information to answer this question now on fiscal solvency, tonight you'll get the information that you need in order to be able to actually answer that fiscal solvency question on the post-instructional assignment. And then with whatever time we have remaining tonight, we'll then turn our attention to accounting. We'll talk about double entry accounting. We'll talk about fund-based accounting. We'll talk about accrual versus cash-based accounting systems. We'll talk about the importance of an annual comprehensive financial report and I will point you to some of the resources that I have provided on our Canvas site to help walk you through how you read an annual comprehensive financial report and the major sections of that annual comprehensive financial report, such as the introductory section, the management discussion and analysis, the financial section, the statistical section, and kind of tell you what type of information you find in each of those sections of that financial report. We won't spend a lot of time going through annual comprehensive financial report because we just really don't have the time in this class to do that. But I think that the video I've provided for you will walk you through a really nice, easy way how you can go through all the different sections of that financial report and get the information that you need to get. What you'll see is after tonight, you'll realize that it's not just the budget that we use to determine fiscal solvency. And in fact, most of the information that we use to determine the fiscal solvency of a city will come to us from that annual comprehensive financial report. And like I told you in our first class session together, if you want to get a good holistic picture of the finances of a government, you look at not only their budget, which is the prospective document that looks at how the city plans on spending its money in the next fiscal year, but you also look at the annual financial report, which is the retrospective document that tells you how the city actually did spend its money in the previous fiscal year. So you combine the prospective and the retrospective documents together, and that's what gives you the complete holistic picture of a city's finances. So hopefully after tonight, using the resources I provided on our Canvas site, you'll be able to do just that. Okay, before we get into our examples of the different budget formats, are there any questions or clarifications or anything before we get started?
Hi, Professor. I just had one question.
Sure, go ahead.
For the pre-instructional assignment, so you want us to create a table, not a table that already explains the expenditures and the revenues, correct?
If you are fortunate enough that you have a budget that has a budget summary that's already done that work for you, don't reinvent the wheel. So you can just use the tables that they've used. That's fine. Some budgets don't have those tables in the budget summary, and then you would have to construct them. But if they're already provided for you, you can go ahead and just use them from the budget.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Sure, my pleasure.
I had a question as well. So if you have already completed the pre-instruction assignment, you just haven't turned it in, should we go backwards and refill it in with new information that we have now?
You don't have to, no, because the pre-instructional is really just an assessment type of mechanism. So if you've already completed the pre-instructional, then you can go ahead and submit it. You don't have to go back and use the information we covered on budget formats. You can just submit it as you have filled it out. Because again, it's credit, no credit. It's just an assessment type of mechanism.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I'm all about the less work when possible, and the whole working smarter as opposed to working harder. And so if your city has provided you with those tables, by all means, go ahead and use that information the city is providing in their budget. Different budgets have different quality in terms of their budget summaries. Some budget summaries give you pretty much all the information you need to know to understand the fiscal solvency of that city. Some are a little bit more bare bones in terms of their budget summaries. And so sometimes you get lucky and get a great budget summary, and sometimes you don't. It really depends upon the city. Now, last time we finished up talking about those 4 different budget formats. And again, those 4, that's not the universe of all budget formats. There are other budget formats out there. There's what's called target-based budgeting, or as our friends in Canada refer to it, envelope budgeting. There's encumbered control budgeting. So there are some other approaches, but we really focus on these 4 main approaches: line item, performance, program, and zero base, because those 4 formats are by far the most common that you're going to run into here in the US, and certainly you're going to run into here in Southern California. And actually, the 2 that you're going to run into most likely will be line item and performance based. So that's why we look at those 4 main budget formats. We couched our entire discussion last week of those 4 budget formats in the work of Alan Schick. And I introduced you to Alan Schick and his idea that a budget can be used for 3 main purposes. You can use your budget document for the purpose of controlling your expenditures. You can use your budget document for the purpose of helping to better manage the operations of your organization. So going beyond just asking the question of how are you spending the money, when you're using the budget for management, you're asking the question, how well are we spending the money? How efficiently and how effectively are we spending the money? And then with the third purpose was for the purpose of planning, that you could use the budget as a strategic planning tool to plan the operations of your organization, to see how all the activities hopefully are fitting together to help you achieve your programmatic and your organizational goals. We said a line item budget was oriented primarily around the control function because that's all the information that you get. This is what we're spending the money on, and this is how much money we are spending. You don't get the requisite information you would need in order to better manage the operations of your organization. So line item is all about control. We said a performance-based budget is about management, because with a performance-based budget, now we're going to start building in some performance indicators. We're going to look at the activities that we are spending money on, the strategies that we are funding, and then we're going to build in some indicators of efficiency and effectiveness within that budget to then compile the information we need to better manage the ongoing functions of our organization. So performance-based budgets are oriented around management. Then we said program-based budgets and zero-based budgets are oriented more around the planning function. With a program-based budget, we're going to organize the budget according to programs rather than organizing the budget according to units, divisions, or departments. With zero-based budgeting, we're going to go back and we're going to re-justify why we are spending our money, these precious finite resources, on these programs that we have decided to fund. So the type of budget format that you rely upon is really going to depend upon what you want to accomplish with your budgeting process, as well as the amount of time and resources that you have at your disposal. If you have very few resources, you have very little time to put your budget together, you're probably going to gravitate to a traditional line item budget. If you have more time, more resources, then you might be able to start building in some of those performance indicators in a performance-based type of budget. If you have a strategic planning process that's relatively robust and already in place in your organization, then you may be able to do something more like program-based budgeting or even zero-based budgeting, probably a more modified version of zero-based budgeting, where your entire budget is not subjected to zero-based budgeting, but rather you'll take a sliver, a fraction, maybe 20% of your budget, and subject the 20% of your budget to zero-based budgeting each year, so that after 5 years, the cumulative effect is that the entire budget has then been subjected to a ZBB type of process. So just like with everything else in public administration, the correct answer is it depends. It depends upon the situation you find yourself in when you are choosing between budget formats. Another thing I really want to emphasize with these 4 different budget formats is the fact that there is no one perfect example of any of those budget formats. That these budget formats are kind of broad categories of formats, and you're never going to find one that is the perfect performance-based budget or one that is the perfect program-based budget. So essentially, if you're looking for a performance-based budget, you're looking for performance indicators. And if you see a budget that includes those performance indicators, then you could probably term that budget to be a performance-based budget. If you've got a budget that's oriented around programs instead of departments, then you can probably call that budget a program-based budget. Zero-based budgets, as we said last week, they're more of a process than they are a finished document. So it is entirely feasible that you can go through a zero-based budgeting process, and then the result of that process is what looks like a line item budget or what looks like a performance-based budget. So you're not really going to be able to tell if it's a zero-based budget unless the city provides you with decision packages and examples of their decision packages, or if they tell you that in their budget summary. And zero-based budgeting, as we said last week, is such a resource and time-intensive endeavor that you can believe that if a city is doing that, they're putting that time and resources into the zero-based budgeting process, they are going to scream it from the mountaintops. And they're going to let you know that in either the letter of transmittal or in the budget summary. And then finally, it's also important to recognize that these budget formats are obviously not mutually exclusive. You can mix and match them together. It is very common to see a line item and performance-based budget together in one city's budget. It's very common to combine those two together. It's also somewhat common to combine a performance and a program-based budget together as well. And one of the examples I'm going to show you in just a second does just that. It's a combination performance program-based budget. So they are not mutually exclusive, and you can see combinations and different manifestations of them depending on how the city chooses to use their budget format. Now, again, for a local government, and most of us are interested in local governments, most of us work in local governments, at the local government level, especially here in Southern California, most likely you're going to be seeing a line item budget. Sometimes you may see some performance indicators built into that budget that will qualify it as a performance-based budget, but line item and performance-based are the two types of budgets you are much more likely to see here in Southern California at the local level. You're probably not going to see a whole lot of program-based budgets and probably not a whole lot of zero-based budgeting either. I think in all the years of teaching budgeting here at Cal State Long Beach, I think I've seen maybe a handful of examples of cities that have tried to use some type of zero-based budgeting, but it is highly, highly unusual just because it takes so much time and so many resources. So what I'm sharing on the screen with you now is an example of a performance-based budget. And this performance-based budget example comes to us by way of the state of Texas. When we had talked about state budgeting processes last week, we talked about this spectrum between executive dominated and legislatively dominated processes. And we said that here in California, we tend to be an executive dominated process in that the governor prepares their budget, then transmits that budget to the state legislature, which means the state legislature must then play within the parameters that the governor put into their executive budget. So the governor gets to frame the budgeting questions in the budgeting process. Very similar to how the process works at the national level. We said an example of a legislatively dominated process was the state of Texas. And you'll see this budget is from the Legislative Budget Board. And we had mentioned last week that the Legislative Budget Board shares the duty of putting the executive budget together with the governor's office. So the governor has to split their power with this Legislative Budget Board. On this legislative budget board, you will have leaders from the state legislature. So you'll have the party leaders from both houses of the Texas state legislature. You will have the chairs of budget committees from both houses of the Texas state legislature, and the legislature will have a big say in how that executive budget gets constructed. But I think this is a pretty good example of some of the elements we are most likely to see in a performance-based type of budget. So you see, this is a performance-based budget for the Department of Aging. So this is not program-based, this is based upon departments. So this is the Department of Aging. And the mission of the Department of Aging is the Department of Aging is the state's visible advocate and leader in providing for a comprehensive and coordinated continuum of services and opportunities so that older people can live dignified lives. So that is the mission of this Department of Aging. Pretty typical mission statement for Department of Aging. You'll see, forget about the numbers because this example is a little bit older, but you have the amount that's what's being requested and what's being recommended. And so here's your first goal. Your first goal is service distribution. To enable older Texans to live dignified, independent, productive lives within a safe living environment through an accessible, locally based, comprehensive, and coordinated continuum of services and opportunities. Then you'll see we list some of the outcomes, some of the results, the impacts that we expect to see by spending money on this, this goal of providing this coordinated continuum of services and opportunities. So our goals are that we will serve 81% of the older population who are low income. We will serve at least 25% of the older population who are moderately to severely impaired. We will serve 85% of the older population, older population receiving services who remain independent due to those services. And then 73% of nursing homes will have a certified ombudsman in those nursing homes. Those are our outcomes. Those are the things that we are trying to achieve. We will try to achieve those things through several different strategies. So you see here is strategy A11, connections. And you'll see the amount of money that is requested and then the amount of money that's actually being recommended by the Legislative Budget Board. To provide a statewide, locally based system that connects people with the services and benefits they need through ombudsman services. So this is primarily around ombudsmanship. Options, case management, information, and legal assistance. So we've got 4 different things going on there. Ombudsman services is going to take up a good bit of it. Case management will take up a lot of the resources that we are spending money, that we are using up in order to try and achieve this strategy. So once we engage in this strategy of providing ombudsman services, case management, information, and legal assistance, what are we then going to be doing? Well, we're going to spend the money on hiring certified ombudsmen. You can see 860 certified ombudsmen. The number of people receiving options case management, 8,730. The number of unlicensed assisted living facilities that we've identified to try and rectify, 300. So these are the things that we are trying to achieve in terms of the outputs that we are creating with the money we are spending. Then we also have some efficiency measures. So the Department of Aging cost per certified ombudsman. So how much is it going to cost per ombudsman? And then the Department of Aging cost per options case management client. How much will it cost for each client that's receiving case management services? Then we have another strategy, A12, which is nutrition services, provide a statewide, locally based system of nutrition services, includes meals, counseling, and education designed to promote good health and to prevent illness. Again, what's the output? What are we creating with this? Here are the number of congregate meals that we will be serving. Here are the number of home delivered meals that will be served. Here are the number of meals that are being reimbursed by the USDA. Efficiencies, what's the cost per congregate meal? What's the cost per home delivered meal? And so as you can see, what we're doing is we're really breaking this budget down into some very specific indicators of what we're spending the money on, indicators of efficiency in terms of cost for each unit of what we're spending our money on, and then a listing of the outcomes and the outputs that we are hoping to try and achieve. So the outputs are the things that we are doing, then the outcomes will be the long-term consequences of those outputs. Again, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this because we don't have a lot of time to do it, but then you'll see there's another strategy, independence, productivity, and so on and so on. So it really gives you a lot of the information that you need in order to better manage the operations of your organization efficiently as well as effectively. Now, this is just the way in which the state of Texas Department of Aging does performance-based budgeting. It doesn't mean it's the only way to do performance-based budgeting. It doesn't mean it's the quote-unquote best way to do it. It's just the way in which Texas does it. And so a lot of states use this type of performance-based budgeting. As we talked about last time, there are kind of 2 schools of performance-based budgeting. There's classical performance-based budgeting and there's new performance-based budgeting. Classical performance-based budgeting from the 1950s and the 1960s would focus primarily on our outputs. So it would be outputs that we are focusing on. The new type of performance-based budgeting, however, focuses more not only on outputs, but also on outcomes. And so since we have some empirical outcomes, some results that we are including in our budget, this would be a good example of the new approach to performance-based budgeting, kind of the renaissance of performance-based budgeting that we saw really take hold in the 1990s and into the 2000s. So this would be an example of new performance-based budgeting. Then I also have an example, and let me know if you can't see this. I may have to share it out differently, but do you see on your screen City of Sunnyvale program performance budget? Yes?
Yes.
Sure. Okay, very good. This is an example of kind of a combination of performance and program-based budgeting. And again, this is one of those combination hybrid approaches that we commonly see together. Program-based budgeting combined with performance-based budgeting. You'll see we consider this to be program-based budgeting because we are budgeting according to the program. In this example, we are budgeting for program number 412, which is police services. So for program 412, the goal is to provide a safe community and a feeling of security among citizens by the protection of lives, property, and rights of all people, the deterrence and prevention of crime, the apprehension and prosecution of offenders, the maintenance of order and resolution of conflict, the prompt response to incidents requiring immediate police attention, and the development and maintenance of a safe and orderly flow of traffic in a fair, prompt, sensitive, and courteous manner to the satisfaction of citizens, so that, scroll down, keep you in suspense, so that, it's not scrolling. Hold on one second. Let's do it this way. There we go. Let me move some stuff out of the way so I can scroll a little bit easier. Oh, computer is not cooperating with me. I'm going to close text chat real quick just to make this easier to do. Okay, so that. Here are the outcomes. So we're going to do all this for the purpose of achieving these outcomes. So here are the outcome measures for these programs. So we hope that we'll be able to achieve an average 7-year weighted FBI crime index rate per 100,000 population that is 54% below the national weighted FBI crime rate, 63% below the California weighted FBI crime rate, and 38% below the Santa Clara County weighted FBI crime rate. So in other words, we're going to spend money on this program for the purpose of trying to achieve these goals. We're also, another goal we're trying to achieve is an average 7-year weighted clearance rate for the crimes of murder, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, and burglary that will be 59% above the national weighted clearance rate, 66% above the California weighted clearance rate. You'll then also see here you have a budget cost ratio that's built in as well. Obviously, what you want is you want a BCR that's going to be at least 1 in order for your benefits to exceed your costs. Your traffic collision ratio, community perception of safety rating of 85% is what you want to achieve in terms of stakeholder satisfaction. Response time you have built in there as well. Dollar loss you have built in there. And overall customer satisfaction rating, again, of 85% for police services will be achieved. So those are your outcomes that you are trying to achieve with the money that you are spending on police services. I'll skip the notes section. So within this program, police services, we now know what we are trying to accomplish. We have our outcomes built in for this program. Now we're going to look at all the different things we are going to do. And so let me skip down here. So for crime control and order maintenance, here are the specific activities that we are going to be engaging in. Activity number 412000 is to provide police patrols. So we're going to break it down to the number of hours being patrolled. So here's the amount of cost, and then here are the number of hours that we are patrolling. Activity 412020, respond to non-emergency calls. Here's the amount of money that we are spending. Here are the number of hours spent on those calls. And then here are the per unit costs, and so on and so on. You'll see respond to urgent calls, respond to emergency calls, provide police contracted overtime, provide prisoner transport, provide field administration. You get the idea. You break it down specifically to each activity that will then further the outcomes of the program that we have already discussed in the budget. So you get a lot of information here. You're not just getting, this is the amount of money we're spending and what we're spending it on, but you're linking up all those activities to their outcomes that you are trying to achieve for the program. So you can kind of see how all the activities are working together for different program goals, for different program types of outcomes. And again, we don't have time to go through it all, but it's kind of the same thing over and over. We just go to different service plans. And so you've got service plans in terms of evidence. You've got traffic safety as a service plan area. You've got, I think that might be it. Oh, wait, I have one more. Nope, that's it. So like each of these different plan areas will have different activities and the amount of money that will be allocated for each activity, but we have performance indicators in there. We know what activities contribute to which goals and which outcomes. It's kind of this combination of program and performance. It's performance because there are program indicators. It's program because it's oriented around this program known as police services. Rather than just being organized around the department, it's organized around the program. So when you're looking at your city budget, if you see performance indicators, you probably can say you have a performance-based budget. If when you're looking at your city budget, if it's organized around programs as opposed to being organized around departments and units, you probably have a program-based budget. If you see a combination of performance indicators and organization around programs, you have this type of a program performance type of a budget. Then the fourth budget type is this zero-based budgeting. Now, zero-based budgeting, again, is much more of a process than it is a finished budget document. But the bedrock of zero-based budgeting is the creation of these decision packages. Now, remember last week we said in zero-based budgeting, what we will do is our first step will be to look at our organizational chart and to identify the lowest level in our organization where budget decisions can be made. All those units that have budget decision-making ability, we refer to those as decision units within our organization. Each one of those decision units will then prepare a series of these things called decision packages. And this is a very, very simple example of a decision package. It's important to note that usually decision packages are much longer than this. In the state of Virginia, they do a robust zero-based budgeting process for their state budget, and state agencies are required to prepare decision packages that are typically 40 to 45 pages in length. So they're a lot more detailed than what I'm showing you here. But here's an example of a decision package or a series of decision packages for this decision unit that's called the Special Programs Office. And this is a special programs office within a county library. And I thought this was appropriate because you're looking at a countywide library for the exercise you're doing in your post-instructional assignment. So for this countywide library, we've looked at the library and we've identified our decision units. So here is a decision unit, the Special Programs Office. So Special Programs Office then puts together decision package number 1, and it's for a bookmobile program. The purpose of the bookmobile is to provide service to remote regions served by the library, enhance quality of life for the county's homebound and senior citizens or citizens without access to transportation. I think we all have a pretty good idea of what a bookmobile is and how it works and what it's used for. But in this decision package, we are then offering up different levels of funding. So the first option is a base level of funding. Base level of funding would be to fund the bookmobile at 90% of what we funded the bookmobile at last year. If we funded it at 90% of what we funded it at last year, that means we'll be able to operate at 25 hours per week, and the associated cost will be $36,000. The other option in this decision package is to fund it at 100% of what we funded it at last year. If we fund it at 100%, then we're going to be able to operate at 30 hours per week at a cost of $40,000. The third option is the enhanced option. We're going to fund it at 110% of last year, so a 10% augmentation to the budget. Means we can operate 5 additional hours, up to 35 hours per week, and the cost then goes up by another $4,000, up to $44,000. Well, what are the consequences choosing between these three different levels of funding. Obviously, reduced funding means lower circulation rates among our elderly library patrons. So we're not going to be able to service as many people if we choose the 90 or the 100% level as compared to choosing the 110% level. Again, that's a very brief discussion of consequences. In a real decision package, that discussion of consequences can go on for multiple pages. So it tends to be a much more robust and a much more in-depth discussion of the consequences of choosing one alternative versus another. What are the alternatives to a bookmobile? Is there something else we can do other than funding the bookmobile? Well, another alternative to the bookmobile could be a van service, but that van service was rejected because the insurance costs associated with the van service were much higher than the insurance costs associated with the bookmobile. So that's one decision package. Here's a second one, and this one is for in-school programs. The purpose of in-school programs to encourage library use among grade school students and to enhance existing literacy programs targeted at low-income neighborhood schools. First alternative is to fund it at 90%, which means we can get out to schools 8 hours per week at a cost of $22,500. 100% of what we funded at last year, which means we can do 10 hours a week and we can serve 2 instead of just 1 elementary school, $25,000 cost. If we add 10% to what we spent last year, we can up the hours to 12 hours per week at a cost of $27,500. Consequences, reduced funding may affect literacy effort and standardized test scores. The alternative to doing these in-school programs, an after-school program at the library itself, but we rejected that because the staffing costs are higher doing it at the library itself, and insurance costs are higher as well. Chances are if we're doing it at the school, then we're going to be held harmless and probably covered under the school's risk management policies, as opposed to having to pay for those risk management policies and those insurance costs ourselves if we do it at the library. And then decision package 3, foreign film series, you get the idea. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you provide all these different decision packages with different courses of action, and then provide the consequences of choosing these different courses of action. You would then rank and prioritize all these different approaches. And so you may say the special programs office may decide that they are going to advocate for 110% enhanced funding for the bookmobile, 100% for current funding for the in-school programs, maybe 90% funding for the foreign film series. And they will then rank and prioritize each of their desired alternatives. Those will then all be sent up the organizational chain, up the library system, and then the top ranked and top prioritized decision packages will then become the library's budget. The nice thing about zero-based budgeting is, again, you're really doing a bottom-up process where you are involving everybody in the organization in the budgeting process. The more people you involve in the budgeting process, the more buy-in you're going to get from your budget implementers. The downside, obviously, when you involve all these folks in the budgeting process, it slows things down, leads to some gridlock in budgeting. You're producing all these different decision packages, which is going to take you a lot of time. It's going to create a mountain of paperwork, and it's really going to displace some of the time that we spend on other things. We know in the public sector, there are these things called opportunity costs. So the amount of time you're spending doing one thing means that time is not available to do something else. The amount of time that you spend putting decision packages together in zero-based budgeting, that's time that you could have been to spend servicing clients or doing something else that directly interfaces with citizens. And so sometimes we end up with some goal displacement, that all of our work is done putting the budget together, but there's less time to be spent actually implementing our programs and implementing our policies. That's one of the reasons why zero-based budgeting was really very unsuccessful at the federal level, because a lot of federal managers said, we cannot spend all this time putting budgets together because we're never going to get our work done as an agency. But I just want to share with you those examples so you can kind of in a tangible way see what these budget formats may actually look like. So when you're looking at your city budget, you'll have a better sense of what type of budget format your city is using. But again, chances are your city is using a line item, maybe a line item combined with performance. That's pretty much the extent of what I typically see used by cities here in Southern California. But the type of budget format used will depend upon what you're trying to achieve with that budget format. Are you trying to control expenses? Are you trying to match your organization better? Are you trying to strategically plan the operations of your organization to better achieve organizational goals and outcomes? Those examples I have up on our Canvas site, so you can take a look at those at your leisure. And again, those are just some very basic, very simple examples. Any questions about those budget formats?
Yes, Professor, I have a question. So it might seem like an obvious question, but I know you had already mentioned last week and just now that it's not mutually exclusive. You may have some that kind of cross over, some systems that cross over. So are we looking at from a citywide operational budget where it kind of goes across different departments? Because I also understand like different departments have different methods. So for example, like a recreation and community services department might have more program-based budget, but they still have operational budget for like facility maintenance and upkeep of facility amenities. And then you have like zero-based, budget for programs that are either pilot programs or something that's just kind of proposed into the new fiscal year. So you kind of just have to provide the markers for what it might cost, like as you demonstrated. So is that kind of safe assumption that it might be all-encompassing too?
Absolutely. That's a really good point. Yeah, the point you make about pilot programs is a really good one, that when you do have a pilot program, sometimes you are being more rational with the way in which you're budgeting that program, because it's kind of like you said, a demonstration program. And so you need to collect that type of information. So it's very possible that you could see an entity within the city, a department within the city that uses a different approach than other departments within the city as well. So the overall city could use primarily a line item approach, but you could have some departments that have some pilot programs that they're doing something more rational, like maybe a program or maybe a zero-based type of approach. So yes, you can have that variation within cities. Typically what we see is we typically see cities as a whole using line item and performance, but it is possible to see different departments within that organization using a slightly different approach. And so there is kind of that complexity that's built in, especially if you have a large city that has a lot of departments. And so if you're looking at, Los Angeles County, there's a really good chance that there are going to be some departments in Los Angeles County that use a different budgeting approach than other departments in Los Angeles County. If you're looking at a small city, chances are there's going to be a lot more uniformity across what those different departments are doing. But that's an excellent point. You can have that variation within one single city.
All right, copy. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Okay, let me go ahead and then shift gears here. I know it's kind of awkward to go from that to another topic, but I really want to kind of walk you through those different formats so you kind of know what you're looking at when you take a look at your city's budget. But let's shift gears now into a discussion of analysis in budgeting. And let me open up my text chat again. It keeps closing on me. There we go. And let me set up the show. Okay, there we go. This is admittedly a difficult topic to talk about when we talk about analysis and budgeting, because there are so many different analytical tools that budget analysts use and for a variety of different purposes. So what I have found is, instead of just throwing all these different approaches at you in budget analysis, I have found it much more useful to kind of organize our discussion around the purpose of why we are analyzing a budget to begin with. Because we do budget analysis for a variety of different reasons. So tonight what I'm going to do is present to you, here is the reason, the purpose why we're analyzing the budget, and then here are some of the possible approaches and possible tools we can use for that purpose. So the first purpose that we use budget analysis for is revenue forecasting. Last week, we spent a good bit of time talking about budget processes. And we talked about the budgeting process at the federal level and how that then relates to budgeting processes at state and local levels. We said, regardless of what level we are looking at, the first phase of the budgeting process typically is what we call preparation. That's where we do our revenue forecasting. because before we can know how much money we have to spend, what we're spending money on, we have to know how much money we have to spend to begin with. So we do a lot of revenue forecasting. Revenue forecasting techniques will differ depending upon what level of government we are looking at. And the basic rule of thumb is as you move up intergovernmental levels, you become more and more sophisticated with the types of revenue forecasting techniques that are used. At the local level, we tend to use more univariate, one variable types of revenue forecasting techniques. At the federal level, we're more likely to use econometrics or some type of multiple regression type of approach. Also, the trend has been toward more sophistication in how we forecast our revenues. I'll give you just an example. Years ago, when I first started teaching, I was teaching at Eastern Illinois University in Central Illinois, and I was teaching the public budgeting course. And I offer the public budgeting course once per semester. And at the end of every fall semester, or the end of every spring semester, I would get a call from the State Bureau of the Budget, the BOB. And they would call me and say, do you have any students that have completed your budgeting course that are graduating, graduate level students who are graduating with their master's degree, who've completed the public budgeting course that you could recommend to us? And one of the requirements of the Bureau of the Budget is they wanted people not only that have completed the public budgeting course, but they also wanted people who were well-versed in multiple regression techniques, multiple regression analysis. And so every semester I'd have one or two students who fit those criteria that I'd be able to offer up to them. And they would go and they would have a useful career in the Bureau of the Budget. They usually work there 1 or 2 years, but then they would make connections with other agencies and state government, then move on to bigger and better things. But my first year on faculty, that's what they were asking for. By the time I left 4 years later, when I would get that call from the Bureau of the Budget, they would ask for not just someone who's graduating with their master's degree, not just someone who finished a public budgeting class, but they were asking for people who were well-versed in econometrics. And in that 4-year period of time, the state of Illinois had gone from using multiple regression to using econometrics and had really enhanced its sophistication in the way in which it was analyzing its budget and forecasting its revenues. Now, at the local level, still, most local governments tend to be very simplistic in the way in which they do it. And the simplest way to forecast revenues is through what's called univariate analysis. And as you all know from research methods, univariate simply means one variable. So two very common approaches to forecasting revenue using univariate analysis are prior moving averages and prior moving changes. Prior moving averages is a very simple technique where if you want to forecast the amount of revenue you think you're going to generate next year, you'll take the 3 preceding years and you will then calculate the average. So you'll add up the 3 preceding years, you'll divide by 3. That will then give you the average amount of revenue that was generated in those 3 years. You then use that as your forecast for the next fiscal year. The advantage of prior moving averages is it's very simple to do. The disadvantage is that you're probably going to under forecast your revenue. Think about something like property tax revenue. Typically, property tax revenue tends to be relatively stable, but does tend to increase from 1 year to the next. Property values tend to increase, and as property values increase, the assessed value of that property increases, which means that property tax revenues that accrue to local governments will increase as well. So if you have this upward trend in your property tax revenue, but you're using the last 3 years, the average of the last 3 years to forecast next year, you are going to underestimate the amount of revenue that you're going to generate in a future year. So it tends to be an overly conservative way of forecasting your revenue. A related approach, which is also univariate, is what's called prior moving changes. Prior moving changes is similar. You'll look at your previous 3 years and you'll look at the percent change between those years. You'll take the average percent change, apply it to last year's revenue, and that will then give you your forecast for the next year. That can be a little bit more accurate than prior moving averages because you're taking the percent change. So it does allow for growth over last year's revenue amount. But univariate analysis is something that is used in a lot of local governments. When I was on the school board, that's the approach that our business department used whenever they put their budgets together and their revenue forecast. they always used a univariate type of approach. They use a prior moving changes approach. Another little bit more sophisticated, not much, but a little more sophisticated approach is bivariate analysis. Research methods, we call it bivariate analysis. Here in budgeting, we refer to it as deterministic modeling. In deterministic modeling, we will use another variable to then help us predict and forecast our revenue for next year. So in deterministic modeling, we may pick a variable such as gross domestic product growth. And we'll look at the growth in the gross domestic product between the last 2 years, and we'll then use that as the independent variable to then help us predict the dependent variable, which is the amount of tax revenue we are forecasting that we will receive. The formula is a very simple bivariate regression formula. You see there on the screen, the y equals a plus bx. The x would be your gross domestic product. That's your deterministic variable that you are using to make your prediction. Your b, as you know from that example, would be your regression coefficient. That's for every 1 unit change in gross domestic product. This is the amount of change that we would anticipate seeing in the amount of revenue that we are generating. Now, the problem with deterministic modeling is obviously revenue is usually not solely determinate by one other variable. You usually need a variety of additional variables in order to be able to more accurately predict the amount of revenue that you are going to generate. So instead of deterministic modeling, we then have multiple regression. And in your research methods course, either the one you took here in this program, the 517 course, or one that you took at the undergraduate level, I'm sure you have covered multiple regression analysis in your statistics course. You're probably familiar with it before, if you covered it before. But in multiple regression, what we are going to do is we're going to take into account multiple different variables to help predict the amount of revenue that we are going to forecast. So in addition to gross domestic product, we may also include a variable such as corporate property value growth. And we'll look at how corporate property value in the jurisdiction has grown. Maybe we will use the population changes in the city as another variable. And so we'll combine all these different independent variables and then use them to predict our dependent variable, which is the amount of revenue that we are forecasting we will generate in the next year. The problem with multiple regression, as you can see in that equation, is very similar to the deterministic modeling equation, except you have a lot more variables. And those B's, those regression coefficients, then end up becoming partial correlation coefficients. And at the end, you'll then see that E. And that E at the end stands for our good friend error. That's an error term. So if you know anything about multiple regression, you know that you will use this regression formula to make your predictions on your dependent variable, but there will be some differences between the amount of revenue you forecasted and the amount of revenue you actually generated. That's a measure of accuracy. So any difference between the amount that you forecasted and the amount that you actually collected, that's considered to be error. In multiple regression, that is thrown into that error term. So it's just kind of dumped into the end of your multiple regression equation. And you don't really worry a whole lot about it. You say, okay, we weren't completely accurate. There's some error there, but it's just going to exist. Problem with that is you never really get into that error term. You never really figure out why your forecast was different than the amount that you actually generated. That leads us to the next approach, which is econometrics. And econometrics, it's a topic that's well beyond the scope of what we are doing here in a summer budgeting course. But just suffice to say, with econometrics, the advantages over multiple regression is that econometrics really gets into that error term. It gets into that error term and deconstructs that error term to really try and figure out why the amount that we generated is different than the amount that we predicted that we would generate in our forecast. It's what's known as a stochastic modeling process. And it is an advancement upon multiple regression, and one of the reasons why most states and certainly the federal government has really moved away from multiple regression and moved much more into the world of econometrics. Really gets into asking the question of why the amount that we forecast is different than the amount that we actually generated. The federal government also uses an approach in revenue forecasting known as microdata simulations. And in microdata simulations, you've got a couple of different approaches. You've got what's called the static approach and the dynamic approach. So say, for instance, you have a bill, a piece of legislation that is going to reduce taxes. So, take, for example, the Tax Cuts and Job Act back in the Trump administration in 2017. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act proposed reductions in tax rates at upper income levels primarily, and then those impacts would then hopefully flow down through the economy, kind of trickle down through the economy, like back in the Reagan administration with trickle down economics. The question is, when you are proposing these tax reductions, those tax cuts are going to result in less revenue coming into the federal government, at least initially. So there's going to be a cost associated with those tax cuts. The question is, how do you calculate the cost? Well, if you're using what's called a static scoring model, you would say, well, how much revenue we are going to lose out on because of these tax cuts? That's the cost of this Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So you do it in a very static way. You're saying, okay, before the Tax Cuts Act, we would have gotten this amount of money. After the Tax Cut Act, we are going to get this amount of money. That's the cost of this Tax Cut Act. The other approach is what's known as dynamic scoring. In dynamic scoring, again, it's more stochastic in that you are saying the impact is going to change over the years. And so, yes, in year number one, we may see less revenue coming into federal government coffers because of these tax cuts, but these tax cuts will return money to people's pockets, which means they're going to go out there, they're going to spend more money, they're going to create businesses, they're going to create jobs. And then that will stimulate the economy so that in future years, as a result of this piece of legislation, you're actually going to be able to generate more money. And all that additional revenue you'll generate from economic stimulation will then offset the cost of the legislation in year one. It's a dynamic way of scoring the tax cut legislation. It's a dynamic way of assigning costs to how much this piece of legislation is going to cost us in terms of income tax revenue. The example of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act back in 2017, you had the two different political parties taking two completely different approaches. The Democrats took very much of a static scoring approach in that they said, here's the amount it's going to cost us next year, irrespective of any potential economic stimulus down the road. The Republicans, who were obviously strongly in favor of the tax cuts, took a dynamic scoring approach and said, well, it's going to pay for itself and then some in future years. So static versus dynamic scoring can have some really different effects in terms of the amount of revenue that you're forecasting to generate, especially as a result of certain pieces of legislation. But there are a lot of different ways in which we can analyze our budgets in order to try and forecast our revenues. Obviously, the more accurate we are in the forecasting of our revenues, the better sense we have of how much money we have to spend when we construct our budgets for the next fiscal year. We also do budget analysis for the purpose of calculating growth rates and making projections. So we'll calculate growth rates, and then we'll use those growth rates to then forecast and project our revenue. So couple different things here. I know we've got some calculations on the screen, but they're relatively simple calculations. Let's start with the growth rate. So in order to calculate revenue growth rate, you'll use that very simple formula I have there on the screen, which is R equals, then parentheses, you have XL divided by X1, raised to the 1 divided by T power, and the entire product then subtracted from 1. XL stands for the value in the last time period. So say, for instance, you want to forecast your revenue for next year. You want to know how much your revenue is going to grow next year. You take the money, the amount of revenue you generated in the last year, and that will be XL, L for last, and you'll compare it to the value of revenue in the first period of time that you're using as your comparison. So if you wanted to use, say, 2 years ago versus last year, and then use that to forecast next year, then your X1 would be the year before. So X1 would be 2 years ago, XL would be last year, and you're using those numbers to then forecast next year's revenue. T would then represent the number of time intervals or time periods. So if you're forecasting from 1 year to the next, then your T would be 1. If you want to forecast 2 years in the future, your T would be 2. If you want to forecast 10 years in the future, your T would then be 10. So T is just the number of years that you are forecasting into the future. So let's go through that growth rate. So if you skip down to where it says growth rate, there you've got your formula again. And the way you would work through it is R equals, if you raise $675,018 in the last fiscal year, and then you raise $648,747 in the year before that, then it becomes 675 divided by the 648,747 raised to the 1 divided by 1 power, because the T is 1. We're only forecasting 1 year here, the difference between those 2 years. So it's only 1 year difference. So your exponent becomes 1. You work through that, you end up with a growth rate of 0.0405 or 4.05%. So $675,018 is 4.05% higher than the revenue amount for the previous year of $648,747. So that's a very simple way in which you can calculate how much your revenue has grown from 1 year to the next. Now, again, if you wanted to look at 2 years in the past, or 3 years in the past, or 4 years in the past, that will then affect that T in the exponent. The T is just the number of years between your last year and the first year in your analysis. So in this example, we have a 4.05% growth rate. We can now take that growth rate and use it to forecast our revenue into the future. So let's say we want to project our revenue amount 2 years into the future. So the formula we'd use for that is F equals XL times 1 plus R raised to the I power. I is the number of years into the future that you are forecasting. So XL, we said, was last year was $675,018 times 1 plus 0.0405, the growth rate that we just calculated, raised the second power because we were forecasting 2 years into the future. And then 2 years in the future, based upon these numbers, we would have forecasted we are going to generate $730,801. That's at a 4.05% growth rate over a 2-year period of time. So again, this is a very univariate way in which we are able to forecast our revenue using growth rates to then make those forecasts and those projections. So again, it's just a really simple way in which you can forecast revenue into future years. You're not going to have to actually go through these calculations in this class, but it's important for you to know, and the reason why I have those numbers in there is that they were numbers that actually came from a previous budgeting case in 697. I don't think you'll be using that case over the next 1 to 2 years, but it's still a good example of how you, in a very univariate, simplistic way, can then forecast revenue into future years. So revenue forecasting is one of the primary purposes that we use budget analysis for. A second purpose we use budget analysis for is cost estimation. So we forecast revenue, but then we also have to estimate our costs. And we have to estimate costs because we need to realize that there is a time value to money. And so the services that we deliver this year will probably be more costly to deliver next year and more costly to deliver the year after that because of inflationary factors, because of changes in the cost of doing business. So we need to estimate our costs. Personnel costs are relatively easy to estimate, especially if you are dealing with salaried employees. Salary plus the fractional benefit will then give you your personnel costs. So those are pretty easy to estimate. Non-personnel costs can be a little trickier. So a non-personnel cost, if you're talking about something like supplies, or if you're talking about bringing in consultants and contracting out, those cost estimation strategies can be a little bit trickier to do. A real simple non-personnel cost approach would be to take the volume of whatever supply you're using and multiply it times the unit price, like we saw in those budget examples that we just looked at. If you're bringing in, say, for instance, a consultant, someone to come into your organization to do training, it would be workload times average unit cost. So the number of days that this consultant's going to be in your organization multiplied times the cost per day. That's why we see the in the Department of Aging example, per unit cost. That's why that is used to help estimate those costs on a per unit type of basis. Sometimes we use what are called workforce ratios, where we'll do a ratio of, say, for instance, vehicles to staff. So we'll look at the number of vehicles in a department compared to the number of people who work in that department. So you might have a situation where you have one vehicle per 15 people who work in a department. That's a workforce ratio. But what we always have to remember is we always have to adjust our dollar values according to time periods. So adjustment to prior year costs. There are a lot of different ways in which we can adjust to a prior year. We can use the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, as an indicator or surrogate for inflation. And so we'll take the Consumer Price Index and we'll use that to then calculate how much money is worth this year compared to how much that money was worth last year. A lot of governments use what's called a cost of doing business factor. So how much more does it cost to do business today in this jurisdiction as compared to yesterday? Where this is very relevant is in terms of capital projects. Because of supply chain issues that we were faced with as a result of COVID, you have some escalating costs. And so a capital project that 2 years ago may have cost you $35 million. Today, that same project may cost you $80 or $90 million. That's how much cost escalation that a lot of local governments are experiencing. In the school district that I used to be on the board for, we were looking at about 40 to 45% cost escalation year over year. And so you have to realize that doing something this year is probably going to cost you more than what you had to spend on it doing last year. This is something that the Office of Management and Budget is keenly aware of whenever they produce what are called their current service estimates. We talked about the budget process last week. We talked about in the preparation stage, the completion of these current service estimates by OMB. This is exactly what OMB is doing. They're asking the question, if we were going to maintain the same level of service delivery this year as we had last year, how much more money will it cost us this year compared to last year? That's adjusting your costs according to year. So that's another approach that we use in analyzing our budgets in terms of estimating those types of costs. As government agencies, we are also nonprofit entities. So whenever we get into the business of service delivery, unless we are a government corporation or a GSE, a government-sponsored enterprise, chances are we are not delivering those services and creating those products for the purpose of creating a profit. So we're operating with this nonprofit type of assumption. When you're operating with a nonprofit assumption, then you need to use analysis for the purpose of finding your break-even point. So break-even analysis is another purpose that we use analysis for in budgeting. Break-even analysis will look at the point at which your total revenues are equivalent to your total cost. That is your break-even point. So Mike Sell uses, I think, a pretty useful example in his textbook, and we'll go through it here very briefly. But let's assume that we have a waste management authority that is collecting trash for citizens in the city. That waste management authority charges $2 per 40-gallon container collected. The costs associated with this trash collection service, you have both fixed costs as well as variable costs. And I'm sure you remember from your microeconomics course what fixed and variable costs are. Fixed costs are costs irrespective of the amount of the good that you are producing. Variable costs will be indexed to the amount that you're producing. Fixed costs, in this example, we have administrative costs of $35,000. We have equipment leases of $85,000. So our total fixed costs are $120,000. That's our total fixed costs. Our variable costs will be $1 for landfill tipping charge per container collected. So it's $1 tipping charge per container collected. a 15-cent equipment operation charge per container collected, 25% collection crew payment per container collected. So a total for our variable cost of $1.40. So $1.40 per product that we are creating, per trash bin that we are collecting. So that leaves us with a situation where we have fixed costs of $120,000 and variable costs of $1.40 per container collected. Now, we already know what our total revenue is. We said that we're charging $2 per container. So our total revenue is then 2Q, Q saying for the quantity that we are collecting. Our total costs are our fixed costs plus our variable costs times the quantity that we are collecting. So our total cost will be the $120,000 in total fixed costs plus 1.4Q, $1.40 per container being collected. So that's our total cost. We know our break-even point is the point at which our total revenue is equal to our total costs. So our total revenue is 2Q, so that goes on the left side of the equation, equals $120,000 plus 1.4Q. And from that point, it's just very quick and easy arithmetic to get to your final answer. Your eventual goal is to isolate Q, the amount that you are creating. So you subtract 1.4Q from 2Q. That gives you 0.6Q equals $120,000. To isolate the Q, you divide both sides by 0.6. Q then equals 120,000 divided by 0.6, or Q equals 200,000. In this break-even analysis, we now know that in order to break even with all the parameters that we have in place in terms of cost per unit and the amount that we're charging per unit being collected, we would have to collect 200,000 containers in order to hit that break-even point of being a nonprofit organization. So break-even analysis is important to use in the public as well as the nonprofit sector, certainly a bit more important than using it in the private sector, but yet another reason why we engage in budget analysis. Another reason why we engage in budget analysis is produce this thing called a CBA, or a cost-benefit analysis. Now, some people call it benefit cost analysis. I guess it's all, if you're an optimist or a pessimist, I guess you can call me a pessimist because I always refer to it as a cost-benefit analysis. But in a simple cost-benefit analysis, which you're probably familiar with from your microeconomics course, you are comparing the costs and the benefits of some type of course of action. We use cost-benefit analysis very frequently when we are deciding, for instance, between different capital projects. So if we have to decide between constructing a recreation center or constructing a senior center, we will put together a cost-benefit analysis, analyze the costs and the benefits of each of those courses of action to decide which course of action has the most benefits compared to the least costs. In your basic cost-benefit analysis, you identify your objectives, what you're trying to achieve with this senior center and with this recreation center. You identify your potential benefits and costs of both of those courses of action. And then you have to engage in calculating what are called your net present values of both benefits as well as costs. The way you calculate your net present value is you have to discount for what we call time and risk. So we know that the value of money changes over time. So if I would give you $1,000 on January 1st, or I could give you $1,000 on December 31st, which would you prefer? Would you prefer getting $1,000 today on January 1st or $1,000 at the end of the year on December 31st? Which is more advantageous to you? $1,000 on January 1st, $1,000 on December 31st. Mind you, I'm not giving you the money, but January 1st. January 1st is more advantageous to you because if you get $1,000 on January 1st, what can you do with that $1,000? You can invest it. If you invest it at a prevailing interest rate of 5% or even 3 or 2%, by the end of the year, you're going to have more than $1,000. So it behooves you to get the money now as opposed to getting it on December 31st. There is a difference between the present value of something compared to the future value of something. Whenever we're comparing the recreation center and the senior center to try and determine which of those centers we should build, we realize that the benefits from those two centers are going to accrue at different points in time. Some of the benefits are not going to accrue to us immediately upon opening that center. They may take months or they may take years before those benefits manifest themselves. Think about a recreation center. One of the primary benefits of a recreation center is that hopefully people will be healthier, and if they're healthier, they'll be more productive, they'll miss fewer days of work, and that will then contribute to the economy. But that's probably not going to happen in the first day or the first week that recreation center is open. It's going to take them some time in order to become healthier through using that recreation center over a period of time. So what we need to do is we need to find a way to make the present value of our benefits equivalent to the future value so that we know how we can compare apples and apples instead of apples and oranges. So there are two approaches that we can use here. There's what's called compounding and there's what's called discounting. The first formula you see there on the screen is the formula for discounting. How we take a future value and then transform that future value into the value of that benefit today. So the PV is present value, the FV is future value. So present value equals the future value divided by 1 plus the prevailing rate of return raised to the exponent of n. N stands for the number of periods of time. That will then allow you to take a future value and transform it into what it is actually worth today. The opposite of that then is compounding, taking a present value and then compounding it into what it may be worth at a point in the future. This is the example of getting the $1,000 today. So your present value is $1,000 you get today, multiplied times 1 plus the prevailing rate of return, raised to the n exponent, which is the number of compounding periods. You can then take your present value and compound it into the future value that it will be worth at some point in the future. Discounting and compounding are very important activities we engage in putting together this cost-benefit analysis. The ultimate goal of a cost-benefit or a benefit-cost analysis is to come up with an empirical indicator of just how economically feasible a course of action may be. So how economically feasible that recreation center is compared to how economically feasible that senior center may be. One of the primary statistics that we use in a benefit cost analysis is a benefit cost ratio. And that benefit cost ratio will take the present value of the benefits, divide them by the present value of the costs. If benefits and costs are equal, your resulting benefit cost ratio will be 1. If your costs exceed your benefits, your denominator is larger than your numerator, then it will be less than 1. If your benefits exceed your costs, your numerator is larger than your denominator, then it will be greater than 1. Our goal, obviously, is a benefit cost ratio of at least 1, but hopefully a benefit cost ratio that exceeds 1. So if our recreation center gets a benefit cost ratio of 1.4 and our senior center gets a benefit cost ratio of 1.1, then from an economic perspective, we would be better off funding the recreation center because it has the higher benefit cost ratio. Another way in which we can look at it is we can calculate the net benefit, which is just the present value of the benefits minus present value of the costs to see if there is a resulting net benefit for pursuing this project and how large that net benefit may be. Now, again, we would hope that we're going to choose capital projects based upon the results of our benefit cost analysis, but we recognize that there are limitations to a benefit cost analysis. And we don't have time in this summer class to go through my favorite example, but whenever I would teach a policy class, my example of some of the limitations associated with a benefit cost analysis would be from a textbook by Weimer and Vining, wherein they look at the benefit cost analysis of increasing the tax on alcoholic beverage. And so they say, let's do a benefit cost analysis of increasing the tax on alcoholic beverages. Seems like a pretty straightforward type of endeavor, but it becomes very complicated once you get into it. Because if you're going to increase the tax on alcoholic beverages, you realize that different alcoholic beverages have different what are called price elasticities. And I'm sure you remember this concept from your microeconomics course, but price elasticity is how much demand changes as a result of an increase in the price. So whenever you increase the tax on something, you are inherently increasing the price point. You're making it more expensive. So as you increase the tax, the price goes up. What does that then do to demand? If demand does not change because of an increase in price, we say that that good is price inelastic. If demand changes greatly, then we say that demand is price elastic. Well, different alcoholic beverages have different price elasticities for different age groups of consumers. So for younger people tend to drink more beer than they do drink hard liquor. And so if you increase the price of beer, there's going to be less elasticity for young people with beer, but more elasticity for young people with hard liquor. For older people, there would be less elasticity with hard liquor and more elasticity with beer. So you need to know what type of alcoholic beverage you're raising a tax on. You need to know what your consumer market is, older people or younger people. You would assume that if you're going to increase the tax on alcoholic beverages, that may depress some consumption, especially if it's very price elastic, which means that you're going to end up with fewer drunk driving accidents. You're going to end up with fewer lost days of work from alcohol consumption. Just look at drunk driving. So if you're going to reduce the number of drunk driving accidents, everyone agrees that is a good thing. However, not all drunk driving accidents are the same. Some drunk driving accidents result in property damage. Some result in injuries. And unfortunately, some result in fatalities. So even the reduction in drunk driving accidents, you need to know what type of drunk driving accident is being reduced. If you look at fatalities, you then have to know, well, what's the value that we can place upon a human life? And the authors of the case study go out there and they do an extensive literature review, and they come out with the conclusion that studies say that the value of a single human life can range anywhere from a low of $60,000 to a high of $8 million. So they say, for our analysis, we're going to pick $1 million as the value of a human life. Well, that's very subjective. What if they would have picked 5 million? Or what if they would have picked 100,000? So it just really illustrates some of the limitations associated with a cost-benefit analysis. Why a cost-benefit analysis is useful in budgeting, but it's never the only tool that we use in making budgetary decisions. It is a good example of what we refer to as necessary, but yet not sufficient. It's a necessary tool, but it is not a sufficient tool in making our budgetary decisions. There is a great article by Williams from several years ago, and the title is an interesting title, but the title of the article is Cost-Benefit Analysis, Useful Tool or Insidious Poison in the Body Politique. And essentially what he is saying is that cost-benefit analysis is useful, but it is not in and of itself something we should rely upon to make our decisions. And all too often we rely too much on a quantitative cost-benefit analysis that really is not all-encompassing. And it's just one tool that we have in our repertoire of doing budget analysis. But what we're really interested here in this class for our pre and post-instruction assignment, especially our post-instructional assignment, is analyzing budgets for the purpose of assessing a city's fiscal solvency. And there are multiple ways that we can assess fiscal solvency, but two of the primary ways that we can do it is by using Brown's 10-point test or using the fiscal solvency indicators of authors named Wang, Tu, and Dennis. And so I have a PDF file up on our Canvas site that walks you through the ratios that we create, both the Brown approach as well as the Wang approach. I've included them here in this presentation tonight, but assessing fiscal solvency is oftentimes about more than just do we balance our revenues and expenditures. And there are more nuanced ways in which we can assess fiscal solvency. In Brown's 10-point test, he introduces us to several different ratios that can be used to assess fiscal solvency. The first indicator, the first ratio, is what he calls a revenue ratio. It's a really simple calculation where we take total revenues per capita. So we take the total amount of revenue for all of the governmental funds in the annual comprehensive financial report, with the exclusion of capital projects, because capital projects are already earmarked for those capital projects. But all other governmental funds, all other revenue for those governmental funds, we simply divide it by population. So it gives you the amount of revenue per citizen in your population. It's a revenue type of indicator of fiscal solvency. Obviously, the more revenues per capita, the more fiscally solvent you are. Another indicator is intergovernmental revenues divided by total revenue percentage. We figure out what percentage of our total revenue is made up of intergovernmental revenues. Now, this is one in which you would hope that the percentage is smaller, because with intergovernmental revenue, that's revenue you're getting from other governments. And so therefore, you have less control over that intergovernmental revenue. Those grants and aids that you are getting this year, you may not get next year. And so they tend to be very unstable and very transient. That's another way in which you can calculate fiscal solvency. And when you calculate all these indicators, the indicators alone will not tell you fiscal solvency. What you are supposed to then do is you're then supposed to compare the indicators from your city to a sample of comparable cities. And so you compare the indicators from your city to maybe 5 comparable cities to see where your city ranks among all other comparable cities. Now, obviously, I'm not expecting you to do that in the post-instructional assignment. You don't have to compare your city to other cities. I'm just hoping that maybe you can select 2 or 3 of these indicators and calculate those indicators as just some face valid measures of the fiscal solvency of your city. But don't worry about comparing to other cities. But if you're doing this in real life, you would compare to other comparable cities. Some other indicators he talks about: property tax divided by total revenue percentage, how dependent your city is on property taxes. Some cities in Southern California are very dependent on property taxes. Some cities are not dependent at all on property taxes as a result of Proposition 13. Total expenditures per capita, the total amount that you are spending on all governmental funds divided by your population. Operating surplus or deficit divided by operating revenues percentage. So how big is your surplus compared to your operating revenues? How big is your deficit compared to operating revenues, depending on whether you have a surplus or a deficit? I gotta move my little chart down here a little bit. There we go. General fund balance divided by general fund revenues percentage. And so you look at your fund balance, the amount of money that you're left with in your general fund after the fiscal year, compared to the amount of revenues that you have generated in your general fund. What's called enterprise funds working capital coverage percentage. An enterprise fund will be for the maintenance and operation of some revenue generating enterprise. And so an example of that could be if you are running a public utility. That public utility is an enterprise because it is generating revenue. In my school district, we had a child development program that was an enterprise in that it charged tuition and it generated its own revenue. So it was in its own fund, what we call Fund 63, which was the enterprise fund. So it kind of allows you to see how fiscally healthy those enterprises are that you are running as public enterprises. Long-term debt divided by assessed value percentage. Long-term debt divided by assessed value shows you the amount of debt you currently have, long-term being more than 1 year in maturity, divided by your ability to repay that debt as measured by the assessed value of the property within your jurisdiction. Debt service divided by operating revenues. Debt service is the amount of money that you are spending on principal and interest payments to service the debt that you've already issued. You divide that by your overall revenue, again, to show how much of your revenue is going to pay off existing debt. Obviously, the more you're paying into existing debt, the worse it is as an indicator for fiscal solvency. And then you look at your pension funds, what are called post-employment benefit assets divided by liabilities. This is information that you'll get, most of this information is information you'll get from the annual comprehensive financial report. And we'll talk about that in the second half of class tonight. But when you look at your annual comprehensive financial report, most of this information is going to come from the financial section, the balance sheets and the balancing sheets in the financial section of that financial report. But this tells you how healthy and how well funded your pension funds are for your employees. So again, just these are 10 different indicators that Brown says we can look at, calculate these ratios for our city, and then compare to comparable cities to see, are we better off than the majority of those comparable cities? Are we kind of at the middle point of where kind of the average for comparable cities, or do we fall in the bottom quartile? Are we at the bottom in this comparison with our comparable cities? So that's Brown's approach. It's a pretty straightforward approach. Again, all this information you're going to be able to get primarily from the financial section. Information in terms of per capita, your population, that's information that you'll get from the statistical section of your comprehensive financial report. But all the information you need to do this is in both the financial as well as the statistical sections. Then Wang, Tu, and Dennis, another set of authors who give us some different types of indicators that we can use for calculating fiscal solvency. So just go through them relatively quickly because I know we're kind of running long in the tooth now. Cash ratio. In cash ratio, you take the amount of cash that you have plus your cash equivalents. Cash equivalent are investments that can be liquefied very quickly. So an investment that you can cash out and transfer and transform into cash very quickly is considered to be a cash equivalent. Divide that by your current liabilities. It kind of shows you your cash solvency, how much cash you're able to get your hands on at the last minute. And so that's what's called your cash ratio. A related measure is what he calls your quick ratio, again, measuring cash solvency. You add in your receivables, and receivables will be revenue that you are anticipating getting in the very near future. That is, again, something that can be transformed into cash very quickly, divided by your liabilities. It kind of shows you what your current cash situation looks like. Current ratio compares your assets to your liabilities, and current assets and current liabilities will be in the balance sheet in the financial section of your annual comprehensive financial report. So this will come directly from that financial section. Operating ratio, this is something that some people looked at when they answered the fiscal solvency question on the pre-instructional. Total revenues divided by total expenses. A very straightforward, very easy one. How much are you collecting versus how much are you spending? Surplus or deficit per capita, same type of thing that we saw in the Brown fiscal indicators. Net asset ratio, your restricted and unrestricted net assets divided by your total assets. Long-term liability ratio, long-term non-current liabilities. And so there's going to be liabilities that are more than 1 year in maturity divided by your total assets. Long-term liability per capita, so your long-term non-current liabilities divided by your population. The long-term liabilities you're going to get from your financial section, your population you're going to get from the statistical section. Tax per capita, total taxes divided by population. Revenue per capita, total revenue divided by population. Expenses per capita, total expenses divided by population. So again, these are just additional indicators of a city's fiscal solvency. What I would hope that you'd be able to do is, in addition to your budget, to be able to get a copy of the annual comprehensive financial report from your city, which all cities provide those on their websites, and look through the financial section, the statistical section, and calculate maybe 2 or 3 of these indicators from Brown, Wang, Dennis, and Tu to answer that question of fiscal solvency. So fiscal solvency is just not about, yes, they brought in more revenue than they spent, because there are a lot of ways that cities can artificially inflate their revenue to avoid the appearance of a deficit. So I would like you to use 2 or 3 of these indicators, calculate them. You don't have to compare them to any other cities, but calculate them to kind of give you a little insight into the fiscal solvency of your city in answering that 7th question on the post-instructional assignment. And again, I have all this up there on our Canvas site, and so I know we went through it very quickly, but at your leisure, feel free to go through that PDF file I have up there or go through the slides and pick out a couple, 2 or 3 of these, then go into your annual comprehensive financial report and see if you can find the information then to calculate maybe 2 or 3 of these ratios to then give you some insight into the fiscal solvency of your city. And I know we're running late. I'm very sorry for that. I usually like to give you a break before then, but we are at 7:35. So let's go ahead and take about a 10-minute break. You can kind of ruminate on some of this information that we have covered up to this point in time. We'll come back at 7:45. I'll take questions that you may have on any of this information on analysis and budgeting. And then the time we have left, we'll shift gears and we'll move into governmental accounting. And I'll show you different types of funds. I'll talk to you about the annual comprehensive financial report. And then again, I have some resources on our Canvas site to help you go through and understand what information is provided to you in every one of the different sections of that annual comprehensive financial report. But we'll do that in the last hour of class tonight. So go ahead and take a break. Come on back at 7:45. We'll answer any questions we may have, and then we'll move into governmental accounting. So I will see you in about 10 minutes. Okay, welcome back. I know it was a very brief break, but a lot of information to get through in a 6-week budgeting course. And so I apologize for the deluge of information in the first half of class tonight, but again, it's information we need to get through so that you can meet the competencies that you need in order to do well and be successful on the budgeting case study in PPA 697. But with that information about analysis and accounting, again, the piece of information that's going to be most useful to you will be the fiscal solvency analysis. And so, as I said before the break, if you could select 2 or 3 of the indicators, either Brown's indicators or Wang 2 and Dennis's indicators, calculate those for your city and then use that to answer the fiscal solvency question on the post-instructional assignment, I think that would certainly be sufficient for what we need to see for competencies in this class. So that being said, do you have any general questions about the analysis information that we covered in the first half of class tonight? Because if not, we will shift gears. Let me make sure we are recording. We will shift gears then the second half, and we will move into a discussion of government accounting. And again, it's very closely related to analysis because when we engage in government accounting, we are doing budget analysis. I mean, analysis is inherent within the process of governmental accounting. Now, in our program, we used to have, I don't know if Dr. Butts is offering it or allowing it to be offered recently, but we used to have a class in government accounting that you could take if you were interested in the accounting topic. A lot of people aren't terribly interested in accounting, and I certainly understand that. For a lot of people, it's sometimes the least engaging of all the topics in public budgeting, but it is important because we know in the public sector, we have to be as transparent as possible because we are managing finite public resources in the jobs we do as public administrators. So it's important that we have that transparency so that taxpayers can see how the money is being spent and if it's being spent properly and in an efficient and effective manner. And so that's what accounting is all about. Accounting is not a standalone function in budgeting. Accounting is something that should really be interwoven through everything that we do throughout the budgeting process. And so as we are issuing purchase orders to make expenditures, we need to engage in accounting. Whenever we are receiving items in inventory, we have to engage in accounting. Whenever we are cutting checks to make payments to vendors, we have to deal with accounting. Accounting is really something that goes on a daily basis in our organizations, and again, should be interwoven through all of our budgetary processes. Tonight, what we want to do is just kind of give you a very brief tip of the iceberg overview of what government accounting looks like and some of the primary principles we adhere to when we engage in government accounting. Now, in the public sector, we engage in what are called the generally accepted accounting principles or the GAAP principles of accounting. And those principles are overseen by this organization called the Government Accounting Standards Board, otherwise known as GASB. GASB is the primary oversight organization for accounting. GASB will issue statements, they call them statements, but will issue statements guiding local and state and federal government in terms of how they should engage in accounting and auditing, how they should prepare their financial reports. The GASB standards are really organized around 2 primary principles: fund-based accounting and accrual-based accounting. So in government accounting, we engage in fund-based as well as accrual-based types of accounting. And so we're going to talk about both fund-based as well as accrual-based accounting tonight. So in terms of that first principle of fund-based accounting, in governmental accounting, we are required to segregate our funds into different fund categories. So money gets segregated into different funds. The three primary fund categories are governmental funds, proprietary funds, and fiduciary funds. Governmental funds, the number one type of governmental fund where most of our money resides is what's called the general fund. For most cities, the general fund will be Fund 01, and every city will have a number attached to their funds. General fund is typically the 01 fund. General fund, that will be money that goes toward the general operations of the government. So salary and benefits and the spending that maintains the daily operations of the government, most of that money will be found in the general fund. Now, within the general fund, there can be what's called unrestricted and unrestricted money. Unrestricted money in the general fund is exactly what it sounds like. It can be used for any purpose, any legal purpose by that governmental entity. Restricted funds must be used for the earmarked purposes as prescribed by law. And so a great example of that in the school district is you'll have unrestricted funds that can be spent on salaries and benefits and supplies and all that good stuff. But you may get some funds from the federal government that are restricted. And so you may get funds, Title 1, 2, 3, and 4 funds that must be spent in certain ways for certain student populations. And so for those restricted funds, you don't have a whole lot of flexibility in how you spend the money. But for unrestricted general fund money, you have great flexibility and great latitude in how that money is to be spent. But the general fund is oftentimes the fund you go to as a governmental fund in maintaining the daily operations of your organization. Another example of a governmental fund is what's called a special revenue fund. Money in the special revenue fund usually comes from a special dedicated source. So for instance, you may create an assessment district within your city. So if you are going to put streetlights in one neighborhood of your city, the people who live in that neighborhood on those streets where the streetlights are going into, those folks are going to get much more of a benefit from those streetlights than people who live in other parts of the city. So therefore, you create an assessment district, and then you charge an additional tax rate to people who live within that assessment district, collect that money and use it to pay off those new streetlights. That money that comes in from that assessment district is considered to be special revenue because it's coming from an earmarked source and it's going to an earmarked type of expenditure. So you want to wall that money off and segregate that money away from your general fund so you make sure it gets spent on what it needs to be spent on. So that's an example of what we call a special revenue type of fund. Another example of a governmental fund is what's called a debt service fund. Sometimes cities will refer to this as a sinking fund, but in a debt service or sinking fund, this is the money we're using for principal and interest payments on debt that we have issued, on money that we have borrowed. So again, you have to make sure you can repay the debt that you have issued, so you want to segregate that money from your general fund. Another example of a governmental fund is a capital projects fund. So we're building that recreation center, we're building that senior center. The money that we are using for those capital outlays will probably come from that capital projects fund. You need to segregate that money to make sure you have money to pay for these projects once you have initiated those projects. So those are just some examples of what we consider to be governmental types of funds. Then your second major fund category is for proprietary funds. Proprietary funds typically the revenue that come in from the operation of some type of an enterprise or revenue generating type of endeavor. So an enterprise fund, as an example of a proprietary fund, would be money from a public utility, or as I had said before the break, money from a child development program that is charging tuition. That's considered to be enterprise fund money, would go into that enterprise. That enterprise fund, the money that comes in from the operation of these government enterprises, That money is meant for the maintenance, operation, and development of the programs that created that money. So that's money that is not meant to go into the general fund for the general operations of the government. Now, different governments will have different rules governing how you can borrow money from enterprise funds. And so in my school district, we had a rule that you could borrow up to $1 million from the enterprise fund, from the child development fund, but it had to be paid back within 6 months. So it's money you're literally borrowing and then you're paying back. So if you have a shortfall in your general fund, you can borrow money, maybe $500,000 from the enterprise fund, put that money in your general fund, and then you have to pay that money back into the enterprise fund with tax proceeds whenever they come into your general fund. So you can borrow money, but that enterprise fund money is meant to go back to the maintenance and operation development of the enterprise that generated that revenue. Another example I have on the screen there for you is what's called an internal service fund. Sometimes you have agencies that provide services to other agencies. And so that money is considered to be internal service money. And so at the federal level, an example of that would be the GSA. The GSA is an organization that pays for the leases for office space for other agencies and departments in the federal government. Since they are providing those services to other agencies and departments, that money is then housed within an internal service fund. It's meant to be paid to other agencies within that government. Then your third broad category, what are called fiduciary funds. Now, the money in fiduciary funds is money that does not directly belong to the government. This is money that the government is managing for some other individuals or for some other entities. So an example of a fiduciary fund could be a trust fund. So we're all familiar with whenever you go out there and you buy a gallon of gas, you have to pay federal taxes, you have to pay state taxes, what's called a motor fuels excise tax. The proceeds of that motor fuels excise tax meant to go into the highway trust fund to then be captured and used for reconstruction of roads and construction of bridges and the wear and tear that will accrue because of people driving on those roads and those bridges. It goes into a trust fund because it's earmarked for that purpose of highway construction and reconstruction. Pension funds are another example of fiduciary types of funds. This is retirement money that is really belongs to the employees, to the retirees, but it's being managed by the government to hopefully get an adequate enough return to keep that pension fund solvent. Pension funds have been the bane of existence for a lot of governments, especially a lot of state governments. I know the state of Illinois a few years ago had a report that it was fiscally insolvent when it came to its pension fund, and it just didn't have enough revenue in the pension fund in order to pay retiring workers in future years. Pension funds are very difficult to keep solvent, but they're considered fiduciary because that money belongs to the pensioners, does not belong to the government. Another example of fiduciary funds, an interagency fund. Sometimes we'll have grant money that has what we call pass-through requirements. And so the national government will have a grant that will go to local governments for maybe economic development. But there'll be a pass-through requirement in that that money must first pass through the state, and then the state allocates the money to local governments. Now, it's not the state's money, it's a federal grant program that goes to local governments, but for administrative purposes, it must flow through the state first. Whenever you have those state pass-through requirements, that money goes into an interagency fund, so the state can't spend that money because that money actually belongs to the local governments. Now, the state can have an indirect cost. They can charge an administrative fee, and sometimes you'll see charges, states charge a 1% administrative fee for managing that money in that interagency fund before allocating it down to the local government level. Again, the whole idea of having this fund segregation is to make sure we're not double spending money, to make sure that money is being spent on its earmarked reasons why we're raising that money, or that we're segregating money based upon where that money is coming from. If it's coming from a dedicated source of revenue, it then goes into a separate dedicated fund, as opposed to being commingled into the general fund with all the other unrestricted revenue. So segregating our money into different funds is fund-based accounting, and that's one of the primary basic principles that GASB requires of governmental accounting. Then the second main principle is this idea of accrual-based accounting. And this takes a little bit of explanation. If you're not familiar with accrual-based accounting, there's a difference between accrual-based accounting and cash-based accounting. And in essence, there are really three different bases for accounting. There's cash-based accounting, there's what's called modified accrual accounting, and then there's what's called full accrual accounting. The differences are, in cash-based accounting, revenues are counted as revenues when they are received. So if a government was to use cash-based accounting, which most governments do not, but if a government was going to use cash-based accounting, then they would consider tax revenue as revenue whenever they receive it into government coffers. In private life, whenever you get paid by your employer and that money goes into your bank account, you consider that as revenue. That's a cash-based approach to accounting. Likewise, expenses, disbursements are considered expenses when the money is spent. So whenever you're in your private life, you write out a check or you do a direct withdrawal to pay a bill, that's when it's considered to be an expense. So revenues are revenues when you receive them, expenses are expenses when you pay them. That's under a cash-based system of accounting. That's what most of us use in our private everyday lives. Modified accrual is the approach that's used by the vast majority of government organizations, and GASB requires modified accrual on the part of governments for just about all of their expenses with one exception, and we'll get to that exception in a second, but it requires modified accrual for the vast amount of governmental accounting. In modified accrual, revenues are posted in the period when they are measurable and collectible and available. What that means is that if you are anticipating property tax revenue, so say it is, let's say your fiscal year runs from July 1st to June 30th, and it is June 15th, and you're balancing your books for that fiscal year, and you know that you have property tax revenue that's due to come in on July 15th. July 15th would fall into the next fiscal year. However, for accounting purposes, under modified accrual, you can count that revenue that you're getting on July 15th against the current fiscal year that ends on June 30th. And you're allowed to do that because that property tax revenue is measurable. You know how much money you're going to be generating. You know on what day you're going to receive that money. So it's measurable, it's available, it's collectible. It can be included as revenue under a modified accrual accounting approach. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility in terms of when you can count revenue as revenue, makes it easier for you to balance your books and avoid a deficit in your current fiscal year. Expenditures are posted under modified accrual when the liability is incurred. So it's not considered to be an expense whenever you write the check. It's considered to be an expenditure whenever there is a liability placed upon that money. So when you receive something into inventory, a receivable you get into inventory, once you have received that inventory, you are then obligated to pay for it. So once you receive it, it then is considered to be an expenditure under modified accrual. You don't have to wait till you write the check as you would under a cash-based system of accounting. So you see there's a lot more flexibility built into a modified accrual system as compared to a cash-based system of accounting. And then the third system of accounting is known as a full accrual accounting system. In a full accrual accounting system, revenues are posted when they are earned, expenses are posted when the good or the service is used up. So when we say revenues are posted when they are earned, what that means is you have a lot more flexibility of when you can count revenue as revenue. It doesn't have to necessarily be measurable and collectible for you to consider it as revenue. So if you know you are going to be getting tax revenue by the end of the year, you have a general sense of how much, but it's not as measurable as it would be under modified accrual. Under full accrual, you can still count that as revenue against the current fiscal year. So a lot more flexibility under full accrual than what you would have under modified accrual. And modified accrual gives you more flexibility than what you have had under a cash-based system of accounting. And the expenses are considered expenses whenever the good or the service is used up. Whenever the good or the service is consumed, that's when it's considered to be an expense. So let me clarify that a little bit by showing you an example. So here's an example. Well, let's assume we have a city that is going to hold a fireworks show. So the city goes out there and orders the fireworks, and the show is scheduled for July 4th. It's a July 4th fireworks show. And the fiscal year for the city runs from July 1st until June 30th. Let's assume that they order the fireworks on May 21st in preparation for the show on July 4th. The fireworks that they order then arrive in city inventory with an invoice to be paid on June 15th. So you've now received the inventory, and there's now a legal liability that you have to pay for those fireworks in order to abide by the contract. And that happens on June 15th. The fireworks show occurs on July 4th. So the fireworks are then used up during the fireworks show on July 4th. And the city then pays for the fireworks, cuts the check on July 10th. So given those parameters, under a cash-based system of accounting, it would be considered an expense or a disbursement on July 10th when that check is written, because that's how a cash-based system works. So the disbursement, the expense under a cash-based system of accounting would occur in the next fiscal year because it's on July 10th after the beginning of the new fiscal year on July 1st. So that expense would be accounted for in the next fiscal year. Under a modified accrual approach, it would be considered to be an expenditure whenever it's become an accounts payable. So whenever you receive those fireworks in inventory and there's then a requirement to pay for them, that occurs on June 15th. That under modified accrual is when it becomes considered an expenditure on June 15th, which is the previous fiscal year because it occurs before the end of the fiscal year on June 30th. Under a full accrual system of accounting, it's considered to be an expense whenever the product is used up, whenever it's consumed. But the fireworks are consumed on July 4th, and so therefore on July 4th, that's when it's considered to be an expense. So the important distinction here is under a cash and a full accrual system, the expense would fall in the new fiscal year. Under a modified accrual system, the expenditure would fall under the previous fiscal year. And you've probably noticed I've said expense and expenditure because you use different terms depending upon whether it's cash and full accrual or whether it's modified accrual. Under a cash-based and a full accrual system, you consider it to be an expense or a disbursement. Under a modified accrual system, you usually consider it to be an expenditure. So just different terms depending upon which type of accounting system you are using. But as you can see from this example, there can be profound implications for using a cash versus modified accrual versus full accrual systems of accounting. Now, I said a few minutes ago that GASB, the Government Accounting Standards Board, requires that governments use a modified accrual system of accounting for almost all of their expenditures and almost all of their accounting. The exception to that is for proprietary funds. So if you have an enterprise fund, like a child development program, that must be accounted for using full accrual accounting as opposed to modified accrual accounting. That is a requirement from GASB that came out in, I think it was statement number 75, I believe it was a few years ago. You have to use full accrual accounting for proprietary funds, modified accrual accounting for all other funds. That's had an important impact in that when you look at the audits for a proprietary fund, one of the things you have to do in a full accounting with a proprietary fund is you have to include the value of the capital holdings, excuse me, as part of the assets of that organization. So for the CDP program, the Child Development Program, the Child Development Program had to include the value of all of its buildings as its assets. And oftentimes you don't have to do that when you are doing a modified accrual approach. But for your proprietary fund, you have to do that. And so the assets end up looking, they get inflated and they look very, very large. So when members of the public look at the audit for the Child Development Program, they would say, where's all this money coming from? You have all this money in your assets, so why are you even charging tuition? Well, it's because those values and those assets are from the value of the capital plan. And in order to get access to that money, you would have to sell your buildings, and that would make it very difficult for you to operate the child development program without having buildings to operate in. So that's the one exception. Proprietary funds are done with full accrual accounting. All other funds under GASP regulations are done using modified accrual accounting. Another important principle under the Government Accounting Standards Board is the Government Accounting Standards Board requires double entry accounting, just like the GAAP principles do for the private sector, same type of thing in the public sector. We require double entry accounting. Double entry accounting means that every expense must be entered in two different places. You have to have double entry. And those two different places are journals and ledgers. So for every expenditure that you do as a government, that expenditure must be first listed in the journal, and the journal is a chronological listing of all the transactions engaged in by the government. So it's listed in chronological order. And then there's a ledger, which is all the transactions grouped by category. So every transaction should appear in both your journal as well as your ledger. This type of double entry accounting is very important because it allows us to avoid double spending of money. We can make sure that we're not spending the same dollars in 2 or 3 or 4 different places because we have them entered in both a ledger as well as in a journal. And that's called double entry accounting. Another way in which we can control the amount of money we're spending and what we're spending that money on will be through the use of financial reports. And all governments will have requirements in terms of the types of financial reports they have to produce and how often they have to produce those reports. Some agencies will produce quarterly financial reports, but the vast majority of agencies will produce these things called annual comprehensive financial reports. Now, today they're called annual comprehensive financial reports. They used to be called comprehensive annual financial reports. The difference is with comprehensive annual financial reports, that acronym of CAFR, that acronym is actually a very unsavory term, especially in South Africa. It has ties to apartheid. And so GASP has decided to avoid the use of that term altogether in that acronym and instead replace it with annual comprehensive financial reports. I've attached the annual comprehensive financial report for the city of Long Beach to our Canvas site for this week. And you'll see Long Beach is now calling it the annual comprehensive financial report. GASP Statement 98 requires all governments to make that transition to annual comprehensive financial reports. So the annual comprehensive financial report is this retrospective document that will tell us how the government spent its money in the last fiscal year. So the budget's prospective, the annual comprehensive financial report is retrospective. You combine the two documents together and you get a really good holistic picture of the financial solvency and health of a city. The annual comprehensive financial report will be comprised of several different sections, and you get different types of information from those different sections. The first section is the introductory section. The introductory section will kind of set the stage. It will tell you about the city, some of the characteristics of the city, the major industries in the city, maybe there have been some major population changes in the city. We'll talk about maybe some of the opportunities and some of the challenges that the city has faced. Just about every introductory section will make some mention today of COVID and some of the challenges that cities have dealt with as a result of the COVID pandemic. So you have that introductory section. Then the second section is required by GASP, and it's called the Management Discussion and Analysis section. This is required as a result of what's called Statement number 34. And many years ago in Statement 34, GASP realized that annual comprehensive financial reports were not very user-friendly. They were not very easy for members of the public to get through because these financial reports, since they are annual reports, can be hundreds of pages in length. They're typically 250 to 300 or even more pages. There's a lot of detail. There are a lot of numbers. There's a lot of notes that are added to each section they can be very dense and difficult to understand. So GASB now requires what's called a management discussion and analysis section. In that management discussion and analysis section, the city needs to explain everything in that annual comprehensive financial report in very basic narrative terms. And so they really put it in terms that everyone can understand, not just people who have an accounting degree. And so every comprehensive financial report should have this management discussion and analysis section. That's a really good place to go to whenever you crack open the comprehensive financial report, because it really does clue you in as to a lot of the details of what's going on in the city that are not necessarily numerically based. So you can then go through and understand all the tables and all the numbers that are provided later on in the financial report. Then you have the biggest part of the annual comprehensive report, which is the financial section. The financial section will give you all of the tables in terms of balancing assets and liabilities, balancing revenues and expenditures, and will give you different balance sheets for each one of your different fund categories. So it will give you a balance sheet for the general fund, and general fund in terms of revenues and expenditures, all the different categories of revenues, all the different categories of expenditures. We'll give you a balance sheet for assets and liabilities. Assets are the owned elements of the government, the things that the value of what the government owns. Liabilities are claims against those assets. And so it will balance assets and liabilities. Hopefully, as we know from some of our fiscal solvency indicators, hopefully your assets will exceed your liabilities, but that will be listed in your balance sheets in the financial section. Then also in the financial section, you have what are called balancing sheets. So there are balance sheets and there are balancing sheets. Typically in balancing sheets, you will see a balancing across the different fund categories. And so instead of just being for each fund, you will be across all fund categories. And again, revenues versus expenditures and assets versus liabilities. So essentially all of the nuts and bolts, all the details and all the numbers in the financial report, you will find in that financial section. Those financial sections can be relatively dense, relatively difficult to get through. And one of the reasons why they are so dense is that a lot of cities use notes in those financial sections. So whenever they need to explain something, like what a certain type of expenditure is, or why this amount of money being spent change from what it's been over the past 5 or 10 years, they will give you that explanation in a note. And so they'll have a series of notes. They may have hundreds upon hundreds of notes in really, really small print at the end of their tables, their sheets in the financial section. So it can be kind of tough to get through the financial section, but the financial section will give you a lot of the information you need in order to calculate some of these fiscal solvency indicators. One important part of the financial section is what's called the statement of net position. And so when you're doing that cash ratio under Wang, Tu, and Dennis, and you're looking for cash and cash equivalents will be found in that statement of net position. And the statement of net position is a table that's found in the financial section. But the financial section is usually by far the longest section in the entire financial report, because that's where all the details are at and all the numbers are at. But don't overlook the last section of the financial report, which is the statistical section. The statistical section is important because the statistical section will give you indications of different patterns and trends in the city. So it will provide you with population patterns and trends. So what's been going on in terms of people leaving the city or moving into the city. It will give you trends in terms of things such as long-term debt. So has the long-term debt increased greatly over the past few years? Has it decreased over the past few years? All that trend information, the assessed value of property, corporate as well as individual property, all those trends will also be provided to you in the statistical section. So any of those ratios that you're using for fiscal solvency where the denominator is population, any per capita types of calculations, the population numbers you will get from the statistical section. So to do those per capita types of things, those types of ratios, You may have to get the revenue and expenditure information. Some of that may come from the financial section. Then the per capita, the population information will come from the statistical section. But don't overlook that statistical section because it gives you a really nice overview of the trends and the patterns over the past few years in terms of migration into and outside the city, as well as the overall expenditures over the past, usually 10 years. And they usually provide you a table over a 10-year period of time. Again, I provided a video for you on our Canvas site that will walk you through all the different sections of the annual financial report and what information you get from each of those sections. I've also, as I said, provided the most recent Long Beach annual comprehensive financial report. So after you watch that video and after you have covered the information from tonight, feel free to jump into the Long Beach annual financial report and see if you can calculate at least a couple of those indicators of fiscal solvency, just to try your hand at it. And then for your post-instructional for your city, you'll then know how to calculate at least 2 or 3 of those indicators to, again, give you a little bit more insight into the fiscal solvency of your specific city. Another important part of accounting is obviously auditing. We need to go back, we need to audit the books to make sure that money is being spent in the way in which it is legally mandated to be spent. So auditing is a big part of the accounting function. The question is oftentimes, do we do an inside audit? Do we do an outside audit? That will oftentimes be dictated by state law. So depending upon what type of government you are, depending upon what types of funds you are auditing, you may have to be required to do an outside audit. Sometimes you are required to do annual audits. Sometimes you're required to do audits more frequently than annual audits. It really depends upon the type of government and the type of money that you are spending. I'll give you an example. In my school district, we passed a bond, a $148 million bond back in 2014 to renovate and remodel school sites. And as part of that bond, we had to put together a citizen oversight committee, a COC, and the citizen oversight committee is then charged with contracting with an outside auditor to produce 2 audits per year. And so we audit that bond money twice per year. That's required under law because we issue what was called a Prop 39 bond, not to get too much in the details on it in the weeds, but we were required to do 2 audits per year. There are different types of audits depending upon what you are trying to accomplish with those audits. The first type of audit is what's known as a financial or a legal audit. And there's just 2 terms for the same type of audit. In a financial legal audit, you are asking the question, did the government spend the money in the legally appropriate ways? Did it spend the money in the way that the law says that money must be spent? So a problem here would be if you have earmarked money, if you have restricted funds, and the auditor finds that you spent that money in other ways that were not prescribed under the details of the restricted funds, then obviously you're spending the money incorrectly. But it looks at, did you spend the money legally in the way in which you're supposed to spend it? Then the second type of audit is what's called a performance or a management-based audit. So with the financial legal audit, we ask the question, how did the government spend the money? With the performance management-based audit, we ask the question, how well did the government spend the money? So we ask the question, how effectively was this money spent? Did the spending of this money help the government accomplish the goals of the program it was trying to accomplish? So financial legal audits ask how the money was spent. Performance management-based audits ask the question, how well was the money spent? I can provide a copy of an audit. I don't think I have it on there anymore, but I can provide a copy of an audit if you are interested in taking a look at it on our Canvas site, an audit report. But one of the main things you look for when you're reading an audit report is what's known as a material issue. And so the auditor will go through and look at how the money was spent and will then cite any material issues for the government to look at. A material issue is an issue that the auditor thinks is important enough that it needs to be corrected in the next fiscal year. So one common material issue a lot of governments see in their audit reports is a lack of internal control. This is a very common material issue, a lack of internal control. So one way that we can control how money is being spent in our organizations is by limiting the number of people who have spending authority. The fewer people who have spending authority, the more control you have to make sure that money is being spent in the way in which it's supposed to be spent. If you don't have limitations on who is spending the money and everybody in your organization has the ability to issue purchase orders and spend money, that's probably going to be a material issue, a lack of internal control. And you'll probably get dinged for that in your audit report. But issues of materiality issues, those are the ones you're looking for because those are the things that need to be rectified. And your auditor will be very clear in the report saying, this is a material issue or this does not rise to the level of materiality. If it doesn't rise to the level of materiality, it's merely a suggestion for you, something for you to look at. If it is identified by the auditor as a material issue, that's something that has to be corrected for the next audit in the next audit period. But again, I'll put a copy of an audit up there so you can take a look at it and kind of see what audits look like if you haven't dealt with them before. But the important takeaway from this discussion of accounting is that accounting is not something that should be done in isolation. Accounting is something that really fits within all of the processes of an organization. You are doing accounting all of the time. When you're issuing purchase orders, you're doing accounting. Whenever you're entering things in a journal and a ledger, you are doing accounting. Whenever you're placing money in funds, you're doing accounting. And accounting is something that's done on an everyday basis in every single government organization. And the primary way we tend to do accounting in government organizations is through this process known as modified accrual accounting. Do you have any questions about any of this accounting information? Again, I know it's not the most exciting information for most folks. It's probably not going to be a major element in your budgeting case study in 697, but it's still an important part of any budgeting and finance course. So any basic questions on accounting, modified accrual versus full accrual versus cash accrual, any of those pieces of information? Okay, if not, then in the time we have left, I'll try and do this quickly. Let me go ahead and share out again if it's still around. I don't see it. Okay, let me share my screen and then I'll just share it with you again. So move things around here again, like always. All right. Let me share out for you. Hopefully you're able to see the City of Long Beach Annual Comprehensive Financial Report. This is what I have provided for you on our Canvas site. And just really quickly, let me run through some of the major parts of it and kind of show you what it looks like if you haven't looked at an Annual Comprehensive Financial Report yet. This is for the year 2022. So this is the most recent report that the city has on its website. Got a lot of nice, pretty pictures of Long Beach. So that's always nice to see, but let's scoot down here to, we'll get down to a table of contents. You can see the different sections I talked about that are standard in an annual comprehensive financial report. The first section, the introductory section, there's a letter of transmittal that will come from the city manager or whichever office is producing this comprehensive financial report. A directory of city officials, and so you know who the major players are in the city, an organizational chart, so you know how everyone's position relates to every other position in the city, and then a certificate of achievement. Whenever a city receives a certificate of achievement for their financial report, they're obviously going to put that in their introductory section. So here for Long Beach, they have a certificate of achievement for excellence in financial reporting. Then you get into the heart of the report. The way in which the city of Long Beach does is they put their MDA, their management discussion analysis, at the beginning of their financial section. So you've got your independent auditor's report, then you have your management discussion analysis. So with any annual comprehensive financial report, I really recommend you start, after you read the letter of transmittal, with that management discussion and analysis. This will put all of the details of the report into common sense narrative terms to make it a little bit easier to understand. Then you'll see you have what are called government-wide financial statements. There's your statement of net position. That's what you will use for your cash ratio calculation. If you want to calculate that one, it'll list your cash, it'll list your cash equivalents. That will all be in that statement of net position. Then you go into your financial statements for each one of your funds. So there's a governmental funds balance sheet there for you. You've got a proprietary funds balance sheet, proprietary funds statement of position, fiduciary funds statement of position. So you break it down by each one of your basic funds, governmental, proprietary, and fiduciary funds. And then you can see you've got a lot of notes. These are all the explanations that they provide for you for what's going on in those balance sheets. You can see here we've got 22 notes alone just in this one section. So required supplemental information, you've got your CalPERS schedule of changes, a lot of CalPERS information there. Additional financial information section, some non-major governmental funds, what's called a combining balance sheet, where you start to put different types of funds together. Non-major governmental funds, again, combined together because it's a balancing sheet. And you can see then debt service funds, capital projects funds, enterprise funds, other fiduciary funds for private purposes. So again, this is all the tables. This is all the specific dollar by dollar information on all those different funds. Then you have your combining balance sheets, statement of revenues and expenditures, changes in fund balance for your general fund. You've got your Measure A schedule of revenues, general capital projects fund. There's a gas utility fund. There's a Tidelands operating fund, a fleet services fund. So all your very specific fund categories all have their own statement of revenues and expenses and their statements of net positions, balancing assets and liabilities. Then you have the statistical section that I said, do not overlook the statistical section because this gives you all your trend data. So financial trends information, net position over the last 10 fiscal years, change in net position in terms of balances of revenues, expenditures, and assets and liabilities. Your fund balances for governmental funds over your last 10 years. So you can see how those fund balances have changed. Have they gone down? Have they gone up over the last 10 years? And the fund balance is the amount of money left in that fund at the conclusion of that fiscal year. Governmental funds tax revenue by source. And so this will tell you the tax revenue by source for the governmental funds over the last 10 years. You can see how their tax revenue portfolio has changed over the past 10 years. Assessed value, so it shows you the capacity of the city. The assessed value of property is the capacity of the city. It shows you the taxing capacity that the city has. Property tax rates for the last 10 years, principal property taxpayers, so who's paying the most in property taxes the current year, as well as 9 fiscal years ago. Property tax levies and collections over the last 10 years. Then you get into debts, ratios of outstanding debt by type. That's going to be one of those fiscal solvency indicators. Ratio of general bonded indebtedness that's outstanding. All your debt information there. Then you get your demographic information. So demographic statistics such as population changes over the last 10 years, changes in your principal employers in the current year as well as 9 years ago, and so on and so on. So a lot of that information that gives you that trend and those patterns in your city, you're going to get that directly from that statistical section. So as you go through the CAFR, again, some of the information you'll need for fiscal solvency will come from your financial section. Some of that information will come from your statistical section. But I always recommend after you read the letter of transmittal, go directly to this MDA, this management discussion analysis, and that should provide you with a good readable narrative to kind of translate a lot of the numbers that appear later on in the financial and the statistical sections. But that is up there on our Canvas site for you to play around with at your leisure. And so that's available to you. I will also put a copy of an audit up there as well, so you can take a look at what an audit looks like and kind of familiarize yourself with an audit if you have not dealt with audits before. Any general questions on any of this information? I know we covered a whole lot of information. I know I talked a lot and I talked very quickly, and I apologize for that. But it's just a lot of information that we had to get through tonight. I think that the information tonight is probably the most dense information that we cover in this entire course. And so any questions on any of this information we have covered?
Yeah, Professor, I just want to see, do you mind going over like the purpose and the process of econometrics again?
Yeah. The purpose of econometrics is that whenever we do multiple regression, any differences we have between the forecasted revenue and the actual amount that we generated, that difference is what we consider to be error. And in multiple regression, we don't really deal with that error. We just include it at the end of our equation, but we don't really think a lot about it. In econometrics, we get into what that error is, why there are differences between what we actually generated and what we thought we would generate, what we forecasted that we would generate. So it really kind of fills in a blank for us that we don't get from multiple regression by actually telling us why we have these differences between what we generated and what we thought we were going to generate in the next fiscal year. And so it's a more sophisticated technique that really gets at that error term. And that's a big difference between econometrics and multiple regression.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, sure. My pleasure. Anything else? Any other, excuse me, any other questions before we wrap it up for the evening? I know it's a lot of information, but it is recorded. I'll have the recording up on our Canvas site no later than tomorrow morning. So if you need a refresher on any of this information, go back and watch that video. Then next week, we're going to move onward and upward with a discussion of capital budgeting and debt management. So we'll talk about the differences between the operating budget and the capital budget. We'll talk about how we put capital budgets together. We'll talk about constructing capital improvement plans or CIPs. And then we'll talk about how we pay for those capital projects through the issuance of debt. We'll talk about general obligation bonds. We'll talk about revenue bonds. We'll talk about double barrel bonds and special tax bonds. We'll then also talk about short-term borrowing mechanisms such as notes. And then we'll wrap up that discussion by talking about the process of how we issue debt and the steps that governments have to go through in borrowing money to pay for these capital projects. We'll see how long that takes us next week. If we do have some time remaining at the end of class next week, we're going to work ahead a little bit, just to make sure we cover everything in this class. And we'll work ahead by talking about how we evaluate taxation. And we'll shift gears into taxation. We'll talk about the evaluative criteria of taxation and the basis we use to choose between different types of taxes. Then the following week, we will get into those different types of taxes, talk about their advantages and their disadvantages, talk about non-tax sources of revenue, and then that'll set the stage for our final week where we will talk about intergovernmental fiscal relations, and we'll talk about the types of money that governments get from other governments, from federal and from state level of government. And that will then should wrap up the entire show for the 6 weeks together. So that's where we are, and that's where we are going over the next few weeks. For the next, I guess, 3 weeks, because that's all we have left. All right. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for putting up with me talking a lot tonight. I apologize for that. Hopefully I won't have to talk quite as much next week when we do capital budgeting and debt management. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your week. Remember to turn in Canvas number 2, as well as your pre-instructional assignment no later than midnight on June the 12th, which is next Monday. Okay. Thanks a lot. Have a great week, and I'll talk to you again next Tuesday.
Thank you.
Professor, have a good night.
Take care.